This submitted manuscript is a comedy of manners following the Bennet family's navigation of love and class, centering on Elizabeth's complicated dynamic with the proud Mr. Darcy.
And the writing is remarkably strong.
Razor-sharp dialogue and distinct voices. So since the foundation is so robust, we'll skip the basics today and dive straight into high-level structural refinements.
Relying so heavily on letters and reported speech to advance the plot occasionally stalls the narrative momentum.
Yeah, I noticed that too when reviewing the notes.
Right, because I'm looking at how some of the most critical plot developments are currently delivered to the reader, and it raises a fascinating question about narrative distance.
Let's unpack that section discussing those major plot developments.
Okay.
Because as I understand it, we have the introduction of Mr. Collins and his underlying motives regarding the entail of the Longbourn estate.
Yes, the entail.
And we also have Caroline Bingley's crucial letter to Jane, which outlines the Netherfield party's sudden departure to London.
Which is clearly a tactical move.
Exactly. It's designed to separate Charles Bingley from Jane Bennet. But in both of these pivotal moments, the information is delivered through characters passively sitting in parlors.
Right, just sitting there.
They're either reading texts aloud to each other or recounting conversations that happened entirely off-page.
And the fundamental weakness here is that this passive delivery really distances the reader from the immediate action.
It slows things down.
It slows down the pacing considerably. And, it dilutes the emotional impact of these massive reveals. When important narrative shifts happen off-screen and are only summarized later in a drawing room, we lose the visceral real-time reactions that make character dynamics so compelling.
We're basically just being told what happened.
Exactly. We are essentially being told what happened after the fact, rather than experiencing the friction and the fallout as it actively occurs.
But I have to ask, isn't that just a staple of the genre?
How do you mean?
Well, we're looking at a historical comedy of manners. Letter writing was essentially the text messaging of the era.
Sure.
So, if the author's trying to maintain historical authenticity, doesn't it make sense that these massive life updates arrive via post, read quietly in a morning room?
That's clearly laid out, and it's historically accurate. I wonder, though, if we've considered how much more impactful these moments could be if the subtext was brought into the immediate physical space of the characters.
Regardless of the historical communication methods.
Right. Yes, letters were paramount. But as a modern reader consuming a narrative, a letter is fundamentally a static object.
It's just paper.
It's just paper. When characters are just sitting and reading, they aren't moving, they aren't clashing.
The environment isn't reacting to them?
Exactly. So the suggestion here is to dramatize more of these off-screen moments.
Okay, so keeping the letters but changing the delivery.
We can absolutely keep the epistolary flavor, but we need to break up the exposition with active scenes that allow the characters to react to the conflicts in real time. By moving the plot points from the written page into physical interactions, the narrative momentum stays high.
I can see what you're going for here. If the plot is just happening to them via mail, they look like bystanders in their own lives.
Completely.
So how do we get Mr. Collins out of a letter and into the living room in a way that actually spikes the tension?
Think about the mechanics of a disruption.
Okay.
Instead of having Mr. Bennet simply read Mr. Collins's letter aloud to the family while they sit around their morning room, the narrative could introduce Mr. Collins through a sudden, unannounced arrival.
Oh, that changes things.
Right? Imagine the scene if his pompous, overbearing dialogue immediately and physically disrupts the household's routine before anyone even knows who he is or what his intentions are regarding the entail.
The friction is immediate.
Immediate. He's in their space, taking up oxygen, and the characters have to manage him in real time.
That definitely shifts it from a passive intellectual problem to an immediate physical headache.
Yes.
And what about Caroline Bingley's letter to Jane? That one feels a bit trickier because it's a devastating emotional blow to Jane's hopes.
It is.
But reading it is inherently a very quiet, very internal action.
It is quiet, but it doesn't have to be flat. To dramatize this, the author could intercut the actual reading of the letter with brief, sharp flashbacks to Jane's memories of Caroline's subtle, in-person slights while they were at Netherfield.
Oh, I like that.
You take the polite, flowery prose of the letter and juxtapose it directly against Caroline's historical microaggressions.
It actively demonstrates the hypocrisy in Caroline's written words.
Exactly, turning the reading experience into a psychological realization for Jane.
That's a really interesting angle. It makes the letter reading an active exercise in connecting the dots.
Exactly. Or, to heighten the immediate tension and active discovery, what if we let Elizabeth intercept a message or a rumor while she's out walking in town?
Like out in Meryton?
Yeah. Imagine her trudging through the mud in Meryton, overhearing a conversation about the Netherfield party packing their carriages. She then has to carry that heavy, dreadful knowledge back to her sister.
So it turns the receipt of information into a physically active and emotionally dreadful journey.
Rather than just waiting for the postman to arrive?
Turning exposition into an obstacle course, I think that's a fantastic way to keep the engine running, which actually transitions perfectly into how the rest of the world is populated.
The satirical exaggeration of secondary figures sometimes risks pushing the narrative from a grounded comedy of manners into disjointed farce.
Let's unpack the supporting cast then, because they are written with incredibly vivid but very broad comedic strokes.
Very broad. We see Mrs. Bennet constantly complaining about her poor nerves whenever she is challenged.
And Mary is perpetually delivering pedantic, threadbare moral aphorism regardless of the context.
Right. And Mr. Collins speaks in these endless, obsequious monologues praising his patroness, Lady Catherine.
So, a key theme running through this material seems to be the stark contrast between the primary and secondary characters. We have Elizabeth and Darcy, who operate with this deeply nuanced, grounded psychological realism.
Yes.
And then they walk into a room and interact with characters who feel like they belong in a sketch comedy.
And the structural weakness here is that this sharp contrast risks making the world feel uneven. But more importantly, it threatens to undermine the actual dramatic stakes of the story by making the obstacles seem cartoonish.
Cartoonish, right.
If Mrs. Bennet is merely a figure of fun, the very real socioeconomic danger of the Bennet sisters remaining unmarried loses its sting. Is there a risk that focusing solely on the comedic repetition might overlook the underlying tragedy of their situation?
But wait, isn't the whole point of characters like Mrs. Bennet to be broad comic relief?
Well, I mean, if we make her too grounded or too genuinely terrified of poverty, doesn't that ruin the lighthearted, sparkling tone of a comedy of manners? The author clearly has a brilliant comedic lens, and I'd hate to see that dampened.
It's a delicate balance, certainly. But the comedy actually lands harder when it's anchored in reality.
Anchored in reality. Okay.
The suggestion here is not to remove the humor, but to ground these caricatures by occasionally infusing them with moments of genuine vulnerability, or giving them a practical impact that goes beyond a simple punchline. You bridge the gap between the farcical elements and the psychological realism.
Which ensures the dramatic stakes feel real to the reader.
Precisely. Okay, so what I really like about this part of the critique is the challenge of finding that humanity in a caricature. How do we do that for someone as loud and repetitive as Mrs. Bennet without breaking her character?
You give her just a singular, fleeting moment where the mask drops.
Just one moment.
Yeah. What if there's an utterly serious paragraph where her desperation regarding the estate's entail is portrayed not as ridiculous, but as a terrifying existential threat?
Oh, wow.
If she drops the poor nerves act for just a moment to articulate to Elizabeth that she is legitimately terrified of her daughters being left destitute and homeless when her husband dies, her maternal anxiety suddenly becomes deeply empathetic to the reader.
The comedy of her pushing her daughters at wealthy men remains intact, but it is now anchored in a very real, very desperate survival instinct.
Exactly.
It adds such a profound layer of humanity. The reader might still laugh at her antics, but they suddenly respect her underlying motive. And what about Mary? Her character feels almost completely isolated from the main plot. She's just the awkward sister playing the piano poorly.
For Mary, instead of her piano playing and her moralizing existing solely as a punchline for Elizabeth's embarrassment.
Like we see at the Netherfield ball?
Exactly, like at the ball. Instead of just being a punchline, her pedantry could be given real narrative weight. What if one of her threadbare aphorisms accidentally reveals a crucial piece of family information to Mr. Darcy?
Oh, I see.
Her constant need to speak could inadvertently force Darcy to reevaluate the Bennet standing, thereby driving the plot forward. It gives her character a practical impact on the overarching story rather than just serving as set dressing. She becomes a moving part of the machine.
That's a great way to utilize existing character traits while tightening the overall narrative weave. It ensures every character is pulling their weight.
It really does.
Now, moving inward from the supporting cast to our protagonist, there's another structural dynamic worth exploring, particularly in the first act.
Elizabeth's early interactions with Mr. Darcy are largely reactive, slightly delaying the establishment of her proactive agency in the overarching narrative.
Yeah, we have a protagonist whose brilliant, sharp wit is the undeniable engine of the prose. Her dialogue is fantastic.
Fantastic dialogue.
But when we look at the structural progression of the early chapters, a subtle gap emerges in her agency.
Yes, in the beginning, Elizabeth's dynamic with Darcy mostly consists of her reacting to his slights. She passively overhears his tolerable comment at the Meryton Assembly.
Right, she just overhears it.
And when she is at Netherfield caring for her sister, she is continually drawn into debates that either Darcy or Miss Bingley initiates.
The material makes a strong case for her intelligence by highlighting her quick comebacks. But the weakness is that this framing makes Elizabeth feel like a passenger in the early stages of their relationship.
A witty passenger, but a passenger.
Exactly. She's responding to stimuli rather than creating it. If the core of this romance is an intellectual battle of equals, having the protagonist strictly playing defense for the first act slightly blunts the impact of her renowned independence.
I couldn't agree more. If she's supposed to be this fiercely independent, witty character, we need to see her throwing the first punch.
Right.
So, our suggestion to address this is to provide Elizabeth with more proactive goals in these early social scenes. By giving her a specific hidden agenda or deliberate social objective, it forces Darcy to react to her maneuvering.
It flips the dynamic.
It does. This simple shift establishes a more balanced and active intellectual chess match from the very beginning. It highlights her agency without changing the fundamental nature of their banter.
Now, I want to challenge this slightly, just regarding the historical context. Women in this era were heavily restricted by social conventions. They couldn't just walk up to a wealthy man and start interrogating him.
Of course not.
So how does the author give her proactive agency without making her behave in a way that breaks the reality of the setting?
Building on that point, what if we looked at it from the perspective of polite social warfare?
Polite social warfare? I love the sound of that.
Agency in a comedy of manners doesn't mean pulling out a sword. It means steering the conversation with lethal precision. For instance, during Jane's illness at Netherfield, rather than Elizabeth simply sitting by and defending her family against Miss Bingley's sneers, or Darcy's rigid definitions of an accomplished woman,
She could actively lay a conversational trap.
yes, she could deliberately initiate a topic specifically designed to test Darcy's pride or expose his social blind spots, putting him firmly on the defensive.
Ah, so she weaponizes the polite conversation. She sets the terms of the debate?
Exactly. It turns a defensive parry into an offensive strike. Think about the scene that takes place later, after Mr. Wickham introduces his tragic history with Darcy and Meryton.
Right, before the ball.
Yes, when Elizabeth attends the subsequent Netherfield ball, instead of just trading spontaneous, witty banter with Darcy on the dance floor, she can enter that dance with a deliberate, active, investigative goal.
The dancing scenes are fascinating because historically, being asked to dance was essentially a polite hostage situation.
A polite hostage situation.
Yeah, you are trapped with this person for 30 minutes. You can't just walk away.
That is the perfect way to frame it. It's a polite hostage situation. So instead of her just surviving a dance with a disagreeable man, what if she uses that captivity? She could systematically cross-examine his reactions, trying to force a confession or a slip regarding Wickham.
Which gives her dialogue a sharp, underlying purpose.
She isn't just reacting to his awkward attempts at conversation. She is interrogating a suspect under the guise of the figures of the dance.
It transforms her from an observant bystander into an active catalyst. When you read dialogue where one character is fishing for information and the other is trying to maintain their stoic facade, the subtext is electric.
It really is.
The subtle shifts in motivation can drastically alter how the reader perceives her strength in the first half of the manuscript. It makes her intellectual independence a driving force of the plot rather than just a personality trait.
And it makes Darcy's eventual fascination with her make even more sense. He isn't just attracted to a woman who can take a joke, he's captivated by a woman who constantly outmaneuvers him on his own turf.
That brings everything together beautifully. So, looking at the big picture of today's critique. First, we address the pacing of the narrative by examining the heavy reliance on letters and reported speech. We explored why reading a letter in a drawing room feels passive and looked for ways to bring those reveals into the active space.
Right.
Second, we discussed the tonal contrast between the primary and secondary characters. We looked at how grounding the satirical figures, like Mrs. Bennet, with moments of real vulnerability, ensures they match the psychological realism of the leads. And finally, we looked at ways to increase the protagonist's proactive agency in her early encounters to establish a true balance of power in the central romance.
To summarize those takeaways for the revision process, try to turn off-page reports and letter readings into active, real-time scenes with physical disruption. Give your highly comedic caricatures brief moments of real vulnerability or accidental plot consequence, so they feel like real people with real stakes. And finally, let Elizabeth intentionally initiate the early conflicts and late intellectual traps, rather than just reacting to the behavior of others.
We want to thank you for submitting such a robust and deeply engaging manuscript. The foundational voice is spectacular, and we warmly invite you to implement these structural revisions and submit your updated work back in for another critique. Keep writing, and we look forward to seeing where you take this next.